Welcome back, everyone. Our afternoon session is going to kick off with the presentation, Changing the Way We Do Things, presented by Peter Binkley, Tricia Jenkins, Kenton Good, and Alan Harnum. Peter has been the Digital Initiatives Technology Librarian at the University of Alberta since 2001. Before that, he completed a Ph.D. in medieval studies. More recently, his research focus has been on analog information technologies of the early 20th century. Most of his time is currently devoted to being the team lead on the HydraNorth repository project. Tricia is a digital initiatives applications analyst at the University of Alberta Libraries as well. Tricia first entered the world of library digitization during a co-op term with Peter Binkley at the University of Alberta, where she worked on the Peel Prairie Provinces project. It's almost a decade later, and she's returned to a growing team with many new challenges. Tricia hopes to one day complete a Master of Library and Information Science or a similar degree. Kenton is a systems librarian, also at the University of Alberta Libraries. In this position, he manages library digital infrastructure and the Unix system administration team. And finally, last but not least, Alan is a senior software developer at OCAD University's Inclusive Design Research Center, where he does a mix of operations development, front-end development, and systems administration support for inclusive software projects. He previously worked at Toronto Public Library in the Web Services Group. Alan's interests are strongly focused on applying agile methodologies, open source software, and web and cloud technologies to libraries and other memory institutions, to nonprofits, and to the general public sector. Please join me in welcoming Peter, Tricia, Kenton, and Alan.
All right, thank you. This session was originally pitched as a panel discussion. I think in reality it's going to be more of two presentations followed hopefully by about 10 minutes of discussion at the end. That's our hope if we all keep on time. So just want to give a bit of an overview of some of the changes that are happening where Tricia, Peter, and I work at the University of Alberta Libraries. It is a significantly different place than it was a number of years ago. You'll see the word new a lot on this slide. There's a lot of new things happening. We have a new university librarian, complete new crew of associate university librarians and a leadership team, a new university president provost, after 44 years, a new provincial government. Thank you, I think. New directions and priorities, which obviously flow from all this newness, as well as a lot of staffing changes, people retiring, people leaving, a lot of new staff being added. It's a place right now of much change. At the same time, we realized, I think a number of years ago, that our old way of doing work, particularly with rolling out digital initiatives and information technology, just was no longer working for us. It worked well early on. We had 5, 6 people working in this area, much fewer, fewer projects, fewer complexities, but it just wasn't sort of working anymore. Things that we talk about a lot in that era, the era of lone wolves, both in terms of people and of servers, having only that sort of one person who knows how anything works at any time, having that server in the corner that we dare not upgrade because we might break it, that kind of thing. We also were dealing a lot more with project silos, so sort of projects sort of in silos but not actually interoperating with each other. Certainly, we could have improved communication amongst the different components of our teams, whether they be system administrators, developers, metadata, etc. In general, we had a lot of inconsistent practices, particularly around the deployment of technology, the deployment of servers, and that was starting to bite us in a bad way. We were open source, but not really open source. We were doing open source, but we weren't really putting our code out there. We weren't contributing back to the community, and we realized that that's not a good way to do open source. We needed to improve that. And in general, we just had a lot of single points of failures. Peter likes to change this up and actually talk about single points of success. We had those as well, but we certainly had some single points of failures. That sort of takes us to where we are now, and I'm kind of, I coined this, hopefully I don't get in trouble for this, but sort of this new era I'm thinking of it as sort of the open data, open code, open content era at University of Alberta Libraries. Our new University of a Librarian, when he started, really drilled home sort of 3 guiding principles that he wanted us to act upon, those being responsive, open, and sustainable. Luckily, they all very nicely tied into the kind of work we were already doing in terms of developing open source solutions within the library. What we're going to mostly talk today about is the journey we went on to, well, it's not quite launched yet, it's almost launched, our new institutional repository, which is called HydraNorth, or it will eventually be called Era when we launch. Some of the changes we made in terms of those 3 guiding principles. In terms of open, one of the things we really embraced is GitHub in a very meaningful and deep way. Peter's going to talk about this a lot more in just a second, so I'm not going to focus too much on that. I encourage you to go to our GitHub URL right there and check out the work we've been doing. We're not only hosting code there, but we're very much being open with sort of our processes, our milestones, our issues, all that kind of thing. We're very much all in on open source solutions. Not so much related to the HydraNorth project, but we have now started to license almost the majority of our web content under the Creative Commons license, and we're also offering free OJS hosting for any journal that wants it. In terms of responsive, one of the things we knew we had to change was just the way we do work. We have a much bigger team now than we used to, and the methodology of work that we made use of is Agile Scrum. Peter's going to talk about that in just a second. We've made great strides in terms of improving our server practice and how we integrate with developers. I won't go into details too much with this particular point, but just adopting things like configuration management, in our case Ansible, which Tricia is going to talk about, and even just sort of maturing how we view this, so getting into high availability of services, so looking at things like Solar Cloud to make sure we have that availability. And in general, just improved cooperation amongst all the different components that go into a project like this, the system administrators, programmers, metadata librarians, and in our case as well as security analyst who was integrated in the process very early on. Finally, one of the things we're really interested in is coming up with solutions that were sustainable to this particular problem. And one of the phrases that we use a lot at work is the whole idea of open source community solutions. So embracing those projects that are very much community focused and have that sort of base of usage and support behind them. So things like Hydra, Fedora, et cetera, that were logical fits on this. And our hope is, rather than put that energy into building those one-off silos, we'll be able to meaningfully contribute back to the projects moving forward. The other big change we made is thinking about all our digital objects in the sense of a digital asset management strategy or DAM strategy. So rather than have a sort of silo for institutional repository, a silo for scanned images, a silo for research data, thinking of that purely as sort of a digital object that gets deposited in the digital asset management system. And finally, we've made a big investment in terms of people. We've made a lot of focused hires in this area to really move us forward in a meaningful way. In particular, I want to point out that these were full-time permanent positions. These weren't contract positions. These weren't practicum students. I don't think that would create sustainability. These are our ongoing operating positions. We've added a couple system administrators, a couple programmers, a new Digital Initiatives Project Librarian. And finally, we've made a real effort to maintain a fairly large dedicated IT DI training budget. So one of the activities we're able to do is bring in a Ruby trainer and have a dedicated 5-day course where 12 people experienced some Ruby training. And I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Peter.
Yeah, so we, as one of the changes that Kenton was talking about, we started using the Scrum Agile method of coordinating our development work. We've been doing that for about a year now. We got into it because the Hydra community works that way, and we thought we would coordinate with them. And it has been a huge improvement over the more loosey-goosey way we used to do things. So we're developing in public. All our code is open on GitHub. All of our working documents, milestones and issues and so on are all there. So if you want to, you can log in and or visit GitHub and follow along as we do our work day to day. The essence of Scrum, the essential elements, you use user stories to describe what you're trying to do. So as an undergraduate, I want to be able to find articles so I can write my paper. So that the user story articulates what you're trying to achieve. Gather those together in a product backlog, which is a list of user stories that you prioritize for the work to be done, and you gradually break them down into more and more technical detail until you can hand them to a developer to actually do the work. We work in 2-week sprints. Sprint is a bad word because it implies everybody's running, and in fact, they should be just walking at the normal pace. But it's the word that gets used. So a 2-week block of work, you choose what stories you're going to work on, you do them, and you have a kickoff where you choose those stories, and you have a retrospective at the end where you evaluate how well you did and look for ways of improving the workflow. And probably the most important thing is we have a daily stand-up, a 15-minute meeting in the morning where everyone says what they did yesterday, what they're going to do today, and what they could use help on. And that, I think, has been the biggest change in the way we work and has brought the biggest benefits. We were a team of different people working on different things, and it was very easy to just fall into silos where you never knew what the person in the next cubicle was really up to. And now we've got much better communication. We bring in the librarians, anyone who's a stakeholder in the project as we're working on it at that moment. And so communication has been vastly improved. As I said, we do all of this in GitHub, so every user story becomes a GitHub issue. This gives us the ability to refine it. You can see the GitHub has this markdown ability to add checkboxes, so we can break it down into subtasks. We can get the comment thread. When the work is done, we do a pull request in GitHub to get the work moved into the main main code repository. Our policy is no code gets into the master branch without a pull request, so it gets reviewed by another pair of eyes from the team, and all of that, of course, gets recorded in the history system that GitHub maintains. Sprints are milestones, so that's a collection of issues. Choose what you want, put them in there. You may be able to see that the ones that are being worked on have the little icon of the developer who's working on them. And as they get finished, as the work gets done, we close the issue and move on. And we do a little Burndown chart for each milestone, so you can see the red line is issues that have been closed, and the blue line is what we would ideally achieve if we were actually going to finish everything by the end of the sprint. This is as of last Thursday, I guess. I checked this morning, and the red line is actually touching the blue line, which is it's so perfect. We never do that. So that is the shape of it. It has, as I said, it's made just a huge difference to the way we work. And I can't imagine going back from it. It allows us to keep track of what we're doing and to work effectively as a team in a way that we never could before. Kenton mentioned our new Digital Initiatives Projects Librarian, Sonia, who is in the room somewhere, was commenting that she's never worked on a project with such good communication as we have via our stand-ups and so on. So we are doing a whole lot more, and we're doing it a whole lot better than we were even a year ago. We still struggle with some aspects of it. Estimation is the big one. There are some sprints where the red line hardly moves. And in fact, the previous sprint, the amount of work, the number of issues we're closing in this sprint looks really good, but it's because most of them were also worked on in the previous sprint and didn't move at all. So now we just had to finish them off and close them. But we work on that, we get better and better, and hopefully we will close that gap. I'll now hand over to Tricia for the next step.
Thanks, Peter. So as Kenton and Peter both talked about, it's becoming more and more important to work as a team with our staffing increases and the different style of project management that we've taken on. So we've really improved our communication, we've improved our transparency, but another thing that we really need is to have that common experience, so consistency and repeatability as the developers. So one of the things that we started using is a tool called Vagrant. What Vagrant is a manager of virtual machine managers. So in VirtualBox, you can build a machine that represents physical hardware, but it's exists on your desktop. You can install an operating system on it. What Vagrant allows you to do is take that workspace, package it, and share it with whomever you want as a base to work with. And another thing that Vagrant brings to the table is a configuration file called the Vagrant file that allow you to change little details, things like the amount of CPUs that are available, the amount of RAM, and a few provisioning steps. So if you've got a base box, what we're calling our golden image, we can take something like you'd see in production. We use an operating system called CentOS. Our system administrators have packaged a bunch of software that's really specific to our environment. We can then use those in our development environments. And another thing that we're doing in production is using a configuration management tool called Ansible, and we can use Vagrant to provision the boxes on our desktop using the same way. So our development environment as developers is pretty much what you'll see in production. So there's a lot less mystery than there used to be. So what Ansible is a tool that's based on the idea of playbooks. So you break down what you're trying to install into separate tasks. The tasks end up as roles. So if you're trying to make a server, a web server, you'll install certain things the same way. You'll apply security the same way. So you encompass those things into roles. The roles are built into a playbook for a specific service, and that service playbook is applied against the service that you want it to be. So we can use the same playbook, or most of the same playbook, in production as we do in development. And again, there's less mystery. It's consistent and repeatable. Another thing that we're doing as the developers is we've taken some time on Fridays to get together, choose a topic. Last week it was some of our tools that we use in development. We were talking about using Vim as an editor versus Sublime. For instance, the week before that we were talking about estimation. But we take this time on Friday, about an hour, sit down, talk about how we're doing things. If there's anything we find that we really like, we'll take those ideas and keep them in our developer handbooks. We've got this up on GitHub. It's public. Anybody can take a look at it, make suggestions if you'd like. But we've got how we're using Ansible, how we're using Vagrant, some things about how we're using Git. And this is all in one place, so it's easier to onboard any new person that comes along. We have a new developer as of last week. He was really quick to come in and figure out how we were doing things, and he's already really contributing to our team, which is great. And I think some of these tools are really helping with that already. So throw it back to Kenton.
So we still have certainly room for improvement with what we have been working on the last year or so. Certainly not 100% adoption of some of the methodology and some of the tools we've talked about. We need to certainly improve our workflow, I think particularly with the continuous integration and testing and sort of how that sort of flows to the production environment is an area of still ongoing work. So far we're using this mostly just on one project, which is our Hydra institutional repository project. How that scales to the many other projects that we support and work on, we will let you know at next year's Access perhaps. We've had a few growing pains with configuration management. This was all new to us. We've had a few epic disasters with it, but for the most part it seems to be working fairly well. as Peter said, this does not really help us estimate how long things take to do. If anyone has any magic ability to do that, let us know. It's still an ongoing struggle for us. And sort of the whole balancing sort of ongoing operations and all that legacy stuff that we all have to maintain and sort of then find time and room for some of these new projects, of course, is still an ongoing struggle for everyone. And I think now it's going to be Alan. So you got to flip this slide.
All right. So I did that thing where you submit a conference proposal and then 2 months before the conference you get another job. But I talked to my previous employer at Toronto Public Library and they were cool with me doing this. So thanks, Toronto Public Library. So since this is a presentation about the cloud, it has to have a feature list. So the Gigantotext will limit the ability of the speaker to just read from his slides. I'm going to have to talk around these points as well. Images have been optimized into their near total disappearance in this presentation, and the Meme Buster Plus technology has decreased the meme usage in this presentation by 100%. So I'm going to set the stage. If you dream your way back through the power of imagination to the early days of January 2015, I'm going to set the stage for what it was at the Toronto Public Library e-services group. So e-services is what would probably be called a web services team in any other organization. It's not the same as the information technology department. There's a fair amount of overlap given that we were working with web technologies, but it's still not entirely clear to me after 5.5 years of working where the division lay. But the last giant website redesign was in 2009. I know from talking to others, this is one of the things that tends to happen with library websites, which is you occasionally get the funding and the prioritization to do a big redesign of your website, and then, well, I guess it can just stay like this for the next 6 or 7 years. So we were in that space that I call sort of the challenging, mushy middle of delivery, where doing anything between sort of very small improvements or content changes and very, very large projects that take a year or more was really difficult to do. So I'm going to take one step back here and say, what do I actually mean when I talk about the public cloud? And I'm basically talking about buying computing on demand. I assume there's probably some familiarity in this room with the infrastructure as a service, software as a service, platform as a service terminology that gets thrown around. There's a lot of marketing terminology around the public cloud and that I think just sort of confuses the topic. I'm not just talking about buying outside hosting here, which isn't really anything new. I'm not going to pretend it is. What's kind of new about the cloud for me, and that can be Amazon Web Services, it can be Google's cloud services, the idea that you get servers when you want the servers, and when you don't need the servers anymore, you kind of toss them away. It's kind of a utility pay-for-usage model of infrastructure rather than actually having to spend sometimes significant amounts of capital before you can start a project. So in the position that I was in, and I was at the time sort of the technical lead of the web services group, this seemed kind of appealing to me. It took the challenge of that mushy delivery middle was that it simply took a lot of time to get something up and running that we could actually experiment with. So there had to be significant upfront justification of the resources, a fair amount of meetings, and it was making it difficult, frankly, to do some of the things that we were requested to do. I think we were in the same position that a lot of library technology groups find themselves in, which is the demand curve for digital projects and new features looks like this, and your staffing and resources allocation sort of grows on a very slow line like this, so nothing unfamiliar to everybody. So what I wanted and what I sort of got in the first 6 months of 2015 and what my team sort of got in the first 6 months of 2015 before I got a job at OCAD University and moved is we wanted servers when we wanted them, whether that was for experimentation or spinning out production level services. We wanted to choose our tools, and that could mean we wanted a different choice of operating system. We wanted to use programming languages that were not officially being supported by the information technology stack that we had. And the third reason is we had a small discretionary budget that I was able to get my manager at the time to peel me off a small amount of to buy cloud services. So I'm going to have 2 slides here about what the tool stack looked like for this, and I'm using that kind of deliberately. So there's a culture tool stack in making this sort of foray out into cloud services, and I would say that's risk tolerance for one, which is for us, we were working in very new spaces. I'm sure some of you in the room have done things with infrastructure in the cloud before. We really hadn't. It was a pretty big step for us in a number of ways. We were going from essentially just building on internally supported platforms and deploying code to that to managing, essentially doing systems administration in the cloud, doing our new forms of code on that. The second thing we had that I was really fortunate to have was I had backing from my immediate management and my manager's management in looking into these spaces. We also had, and I think this is probably coming through, we had some frustration with the status quo simply about kind of the number of constraints that were on doing new things for us. So those things kind of came together, and this is where I think that the public cloud and what's emerged in the last 4 or 5 years made this possible in a way that wouldn't have been previously before. Like basically no budget for this. I couldn't have bought any kind of server for what I had for this, but I could buy little tiny instances in the internet. The tech tool stack for this is the actual names of technology pieces that we use for this. Has anyone used DigitalOcean for their cloud stuff? See a couple of hands. Cool. Love DigitalOcean. Way lower barriers to entry, I would say, than Amazon Web Services. Less of a need to learn new paradigms, and really cheap. Really good service, great web interface. Ansible, which is one of the points of overlap with the U of A people. That's what we were using for automation for everything from configuration management to deployment management to reproducible infrastructure. And in terms of language choice, we settled on Ruby for doing product development really quickly and bringing things to fruition. That kind of like mushy middle of projects in terms of complex new, reasonably complex new features, small microsites, what would be called in an academic context maybe digital humanities projects, things that were really on kind of the monolithic site architecture that we had, just a pain to do. So what we delivered with this, we delivered a couple of things. This is the project that's very near and dear to my heart because I was basically, along with a designer and a UX person, the solo developer on it for 6 weeks, which was the Toronto Poetry Map. This was Ruby on Rails, the leaflet mapping library in Mapbox. We built it in about 6 weeks, which is exponentially faster than how we'd been able to build projects of comparable complexity. It's still being updated with new content as it comes in. So this is kind of an attempt to geographically map poetry onto Toronto streets. It was an initiative of the library and the current Poet Laureate of Toronto at the time, George Eliot Clark. This is one of the few images in this presentation, which is what it looks like. If you want to check it out, it's torontopoetry.ca. I read a lot of poetry in addition to the only 2 things I really like in the world that aren't people are poetry and software development. So being able to do this project was pretty much perfect for me. The other thing that we built with this, which was pretty cool in a library context, is a service for delivering overdrives, holds, and copies in real time to the library's website. This is what, is anybody, hands up if you're familiar with the term microservices? See a couple of hands. Yeah, probably a fair number of people. This is basically just the idea, which is quite a few years old now in the world of web software development in particular, that rather than having big monolithic websites that do 100 different things, you should have 100 little pieces of code that do very specific things, and then you kind of combine them together to make your website. So rather than having to do a complete website overhaul to get new features, you swap in and swap out and refactor and improve and change these services and add new ones as you need them. So this delivers real-time holds and copies for the Overdrive ebook collection to the library. And it serves this, I like having these numbers in here, and I pulled these a couple of months ago. To give you a sense of what it costs to scale these things, this serves about 16,000 requests a day on 20% of the capacity of a $10 a month instance. So really not very expensive at all. This is a bunch of code that you probably can't see and is not all that interesting. But if you load any ebook on the Toronto Public Library's website or a search result that has Overdrive ebooks, if you watch, you can see a brief flicker as it loads these services, because it's loading them asynchronously over JavaScript, because we're running a separate dedicated service in the cloud that the website reaches out to, passes the ID transacts with the Overdrive API and passes it back. So in terms of letting us work with things that had taken quite a bit of time to implement previously in terms of vendor-specific APIs, I think the one developer who was working on this did this in about 10 days, I would say. So fast delivery, effective, still up, cheap. Microsites. I think that most people here are from academic libraries, so you may not be as familiar with this, but because these tended to come for special events or marketing, and in the past, these were little discrete static sites. They might be a couple of pages. We sort of just kind of took them and then wedged them into the existing site infrastructure, and it didn't work very well, and we didn't like it. What we did as soon as we started getting space in the cloud is deploying them to dedicated Nginx servers, so just serving lots of different static sites from one inexpensive server, which really increased our options for stuff. These are two of the sites that we built with them. So the lessons and caveats. Privacy in the cloud, we didn't go near it. Nothing that we deployed dealt with user information at all. I have a lot of opinions about privacy in the cloud that I'll be happy to talk to at some other point. The culture matters a lot, but so do the tools. I sometimes think that there's an overemphasis in culture in talking about organizational change. Certain tools support certain cultural changes. They feed into each other. It's surprisingly cheap to do this stuff. One of the things, and it's actually getting cheaper. This is one of the things that you can see happening with the public cloud if you do comparisons of what compute costs and what storage costs versus 5 years ago. It's going down. As more and more players enter the space and compete with each other, we see an increasing sort of move towards utility models and commodity models, which is things just are going to get probably cheaper. This is the one place where I kind of have swear words in my presentation, which if anyone else has seen me present before is pretty good for me. Work smarter, not harder. We all hate hearing this because we mostly know what this is code for, which is you're not going to get any extra staffing for the next year, but you got to do a whole bunch of extra stuff. It's not always just austerity age crap. There is tooling out there that will let you do this if you look for it. And this is the thought leadership futurology entrail reading slide. Tech history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. You can look at what's happening with the public cloud and compute costs and look at things that have happened previously around electrification or telecommunications and say that we're probably going to see roughly similar patterns in terms of the move from on-premises to a mix of on-premises and utilities to probably a mix of utilities by default with on-premises as backup. In the same way that you don't generate all your electricity from generators these days, you buy them off the grid with potentially a generator for backup. That's where I personally think things are going. Second point, which probably undercuts that, is the separation of value from hype is a key technology skill. I think it is probably the key technology skill. The third one, which is where probably feeds into that second one as well, our funders, and I have heard of this happening with some library systems and some government organizations, the belief from our funders that we may be able to save money doing this may require us to move in this direction regardless of what our desires are, which I think is one of the reasons that we should, as professionals, be informed about this space, and because I think this is coming. You see it in shared services reviews, you see it in the government of Ontario having moved roughly, I think they've closed 90% of their data centers in the last 2 years and are moving a lot of stuff onto AWS. So it's probably coming for us as well. And I'm at my 15-minute mark, and I want to leave some time for questions. So these are 3 things you might want to read. This is mostly just the stuff that I'm reading right now. The Docker book is just there because I don't know enough about Docker, but this is another big trend, which is really similar to what was talked about in terms of Vagrant, just application portability, containerization of applications. And I had some questions for the audience, because I'm going to reverse things and nobody has to actually answer these right now. I want to give time for any questions you have for me or the U of A folks. The privacy one I know is a big one. I'd be interested in people's thoughts on that. But I'm going to turn that over to questions for the next 10 minutes now. Thank you. Thank you.
Any questions out there? Yeah. Great. So for folks watching online, the questions asking particularly the U of A folks to talk about the relationship with the rest of the library and the institution. To what degree do they understand what you're doing? Go ahead.
Am I on? Is this microphone going to work? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we work. The HydraNorth project involves working with a lot of areas, and we've been taking the Scrum model of having stakeholders who are responsible for setting priorities in certain areas. We go out and tell people, you are now our stakeholder for this because it impinges on your job in some way. So we pull them in, and that's worked pretty well. But that doesn't reach out to great swathes of the rest of the library who are engaged in public service or something that doesn't yet overlap very strongly with what we're doing. We have presented at Library Council describing the Scrum methodology, and a lot of people were really interested in it and wanted to talk about ways of applying it in non-technology areas of the library. Nothing has come of that yet, but I think the idea has been planted at least. So yeah, so I think we've had a lot of success in getting the people we need to come in and take part, but we haven't expanded out very far yet.
Any other questions?
Any answers to my questions?
Yeah, and that's a good it's a good point about digital. Like one of the things that's a really big deal about this stuff is the on demand. So if you want to just spin something up to test it or spin something up for somebody else to look at, you only pay for the usage. I've done demos where I've brought, using Ansible and DigitalOcean, somewhere between 6 and 7 instances up at a go, so that everybody could have their own instance to interact with and use for tutorials. So it's great for that, like the ability to just spin things up and then dispose of them when you don't need them anymore. I found for the level of traffic that we were getting at Toronto Public Library, we didn't need to scale above, I think, the $10 instances for what we were running in production. But I think that for I would tend to agree, based on the pricing that I know of, that for things above that, for running like an entire integrated library system or something like Islandora, you'd probably want to go towards something like AWS.
Any other questions or comments? Yes.
I work for a fairly small organization, but we have a kind of a large footprint. And we're just starting to dip our toes into using cloud space. And what I'm finding with it is that, yes, it works, but there's an administrative infrastructure that's required for that that's probably a little bigger than I would have anticipated originally. And so I find I'm spending a lot of time dealing with issues and nowhere else to put them.
Okay, so the comment was about a small organization exploring cloud spaces, but having an administrative infrastructure that's larger than what's expected, and how to manage that.
Yeah, and I guess the cloud's not magic. Somebody's got to be administering the servers, and if you're talking about infrastructure as a service, that's you. You don't have to be managing the data center. You might have a nice web-based interface for spinning up your VMs, but someone's still got to be responsible for patching. One of the things I didn't talk about is that we have made some use of Heroku for specific projects, or we did that at Toronto Public Library. Heroku is great if you just want to deploy applications directly from GitHub and not have to kind of worry about doing patching or administration or otherwise. You need to really get used to their paradigm, and it costs a lot more for the proportion amount of compute power and storage power you get than something like AWS Compute or DigitalOcean. But a lot of I think one of the big things about cloud pricing is you have to have some sense of what the total cost of ownership looks like, and down to the level of kind of like, what does the electricity cost to run these servers in our data center. But yeah, someone's going to have to administer it. It's going to be someone you pay on premises, or it's going to be an engineer in a data center somewhere.
Do we have time for one more question, or any final questions? No? Okay, well, join me in thanking our panel speakers.